Taking the trams and trains back into public operation will be discussed at this weekend's State Labor Party conference. The Rail, Tram and Bus Union want an end to rail franchising, just like the South Australian government has recently done. Firstly, I need to point out that for passengers and the network, it's a second-order issue. Provided you've got integrated planning and fares, it doesn't matter very much whether rail is privately or publicly operated. You can have good and bad publicly run systems and good and bad privately operated systems. Unless a network is being very badly or very inefficiently operated, then changing the arrangement you currently have isn't going to be much benefit. Those who are pressing for such a change, whether it's to go from public to private or from private to public, need to make that case very strongly. Because there is a cost. Changing things for no strong reason diverts attention from what's really important. That's because bureaucrats and governments can often only juggle 2 or 3 balls at any one time. If they pick up an unimportant ball, then they almost certainly have to drop one that is more important. Examples of issues that get a lot of department and media attention, but I regard as lower order to the basics of providing a good public transport service, include 1. Franchising and contracting, including potential public or private operation. 2. Ticketing. We've wasted so much time on various ticketing systems, especially here in Victoria. Thirdly, branding. Even more of a waste, and Victoria is a particularly bad offender for this. And fourthly, bus electrification. At best, they are second order. At worst, like rebranding, and we're just going through yet another with Transport Victoria, they are trivial nonsense. Real examples where we have dropped the ball include the Rail Network Development Plan. Had we got the timetable upgrades, then most lines would have a frequent service in time for the metro tunnel to open. Since we haven't done all that preparatory work, it will be very common to leave a metro tunnel train to transfer to another, but still have a 29 or 19-minute wait to the next train. Had we sorted out the timetables for the rest of the network before the metro tunnel, then you wouldn't have those problems for the vast majority of the network. Another example is the bus plan, including bus network reforms in Melbourne's northern suburbs that were foreshadowed in a 2022 network review. That seemed to have gone off the radar, with the government more interested in bus recontracting and electrification, which, even if you have electric buses, and yes, they may be more pleasant to ride, but if your bus only runs infrequently over short hours of the day, then that's not really going to encourage many more people to use it. When you are evaluating what's important and what's not, it's important not to be swayed by emotion. I think we in Victoria are a bit more prone to that than on average, and that can really skew decisions. For example, there is a lot of sentimentality over tram conductors, but that made operating the service much more expensive. People seem to forget that when we did have tram conductors, tram services on Sundays, for example, were only every 20 or 30 minutes at best. We still have remnants of that in the early mornings on Sundays, but most of the day timetables have been improved since. Things were not always so good in the past, and people's memories can be unreliable. More recently, there's V-Line versus Metro. In the CanStar Blue surveys across Australia's capitals, Metro does not score particularly well. Even Brisbane, with its 30-minute gaps, scores better. V-Line seems to have the better reputation. But look at their cancellation data. They cancel twice as many proportion of trains that Metro does. V-Line's punctuality is worse as well. So can't always rely on impressions. Look at the data, that's very important. Okay, so what are the top issues for trains and trams? For Metro trains, it's frequency and reliability. For frequency, we need to ditch 40-year-old timetables in favour of simpler and more frequent service. For reliability, we need good maintenance, fewer faults, and preferably fewer bus replacement events. Trams, all the above, plus better accessibility, more priority over cars, network reform, and some minor extensions. All of these are a matter of political will. Nothing to do with whether it's private versus public operation. Okay, so let's talk about management quality. If we take a low bar, that is being investigated by IBAC, then V-Line has performed poorly. Operations Lansdowne and Esperance both involved V-Line. At least twice in the last decade has the government needed to sack the V-Line CEO. Metro and Yarra Trams management appears to have been a bit more stable. Now, if Metro were publicly operated, there is a possibility that their management may be different, and not necessarily for the better. More leaders with political connections and fewer with operational expertise is a risk. I did a blog post about the backgrounds of DTP, DepSex, and transport operational experience. Didn't feature very highly. Although I do need to mention, for balance, the current DTP secretary does score very high here compared to his predecessor. A distribution of power. Now, the private operators are effectively franchised monopolies for their utility. They are not a true business in that they can control what they produce, nor its price. Things are very, very tightly controlled in the franchise agreements. The only way they can increase their profit is by cutting costs or through negotiating favourably with the government. Now, some of the cost-cutting issues can be cutting corners if the government isn't vigilant in supervising that. As for negotiating favourably with the government, well, if the private operator is too good at that, then the taxpayer is the loser as they pay too much for the service. Or maybe the passenger is the loser if they're not getting as much frequent service as they should for the money the operator is being paid. And bear in mind, a lot of rail costs are fixed, so that improvements in frequency should be only a marginal increase, especially at off-peak times. A lot of whether we get value for money or not is up to the quality of the huge bureaucracy that has to manage contracts in a franchise system. If the private operator can hire the top lawyers and lobbyists and the public service is restricted, then there is a risk of regulatory capture and rent-seeking behaviour. Profits can become excessive for little risk. Normally, you can accept high profits if it's high risk, but if it's low risk, like a rail franchise, then the profit margins need to be low. If they're not low, perhaps we're not getting the best value for money. And it does seem that nearly every time franchises are renegotiated, they are at better and better terms for the private operators. Maybe sometimes that's justified. When you look into the history of the first franchises falling over, maybe they were too cheap. Still, getting low cost per service kilometre is absolutely critical to affording the frequent service all week that Sydney and Perth currently have, but Melbourne often lacks. Buses are also run by contracted operators, but it's interesting that their costs per kilometre relative to CPI seems to have held flatter than compared to train and tram. So, on the face of it, better value for money may be a reason to reappraise private franchising, like we currently do it. However, taking rail operations back into government poses risk too. I previously mentioned V-Line's mediocre operational performance compared with metro trains. Private operator franchise contracts have various call-in provisions if performance suffers. It rarely happens, but at worst the government can step in. Or, like Connex, they can just not renew their contract. Whereas you can't really sack a government operator. Having said that, I recommend reading my blog item, which I'll include a link in the video description, on Simon Lane's Without Delay book. That, perhaps unexpectedly, comes down in favour of public operation, in view of what he saw as the administrative bloat associated with administering the franchising system, at least here in Victoria. I mentioned regulatory capture before. With government operation, there are fewer layers between service delivery and government. Now that sounds like it could be more efficient and more publicly accountable, and fans of public operation will definitely agree. But there's also industrial relations. That is particularly fought under a Labor government, as both RTBU, the Union for Train and Tram Drivers, and TWU, the Union for Bus Drivers, are affiliated to the party. If you read about the demise of the Kane-Kerner government, you can appreciate quite readily why the Bracks government, and for that matter, the left faction Transport Minister Peter Batchelor, refused to take metropolitan train and tram contracts back into government operation. That is despite later being admitted by, I think, Minister Lynn Koski, that the private franchise operation was no cheaper than if they'd remained government run. More recently, we've seen the publicly operated Sydney train system with a lot of strikes and industrial disputes. When you look at various government records, you can see that the parties do have different strengths when in government. The Liberals under Minister Alan Brown in the 1990s and Terry Moulder in the early 2010s presided over rail frequency upgrades and reliability improvements. But their governments built very little for rail. Whereas the Kane, Kerner, Bracks and Brumby governments presided over rail reliability declines and also under Kane and Kerner, industrial disputation. However, the current Andrews-Allen government has presided over huge construction projects. Trains are still often disrupted, but it's more likely due to bus replacements because of construction projects than industrial disputation. Now, as I said before, governments can only juggle a few things at once. Construction projects are a lot more worthy than most other things, but emphasis on them has still coincided with reduced government interest in service reform and frequency boosts on most metro lines, despite being highly effective and impactful. Right now, we are terrible at using our expensive rail assets that we're adding to in the big build fully or weak. The biggest priority should be increased all-day frequencies. Now, how do we actually pay for them? Well, currently the government is in a saving, not spending mood. So cost effectiveness in driving cost per service kilometre reductions with either private franchise operators or publicly, if rail was to be taken back into public operation, is absolutely critical. Private operation has pitfalls including arguably expensive contracts, duplications of senior roles because you've got both management in the private operator and also huge numbers of contract supervision roles in the department, and regulatory capture. As a Victorian taxpayer, I would prefer the profits went into better service or at least stayed here. But then, of course, public operation. That has risks of inferior management, political capture, and reduced accountability. It may also be more prone to pressure from unions, which, as is their legitimate purpose, advocate for their members' welfare. But in certain cases, that can lead to inefficiencies, with the travelling public missing out on better service that could have been afforded. So to sum up, I'm agnostic on private versus public operation for our trains and trams. Other matters are much more important in determining whether we have a good service or not. Prove it's run very badly or very inefficiently, and you may change my mind.